You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority. But the state is still formidable. Or is it? You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society. Let's dive headfirst into The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm very excited to welcome as my guest today, Professor Michael Huemer. Welcome, sir, to The White Pill Box.
Thanks. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Folks, Michael Huemer is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado at Boulder and the author of more than 90 academic articles and some 12 books that cover ethics, epistemology, political philosophy, and metaphysics. I'll have his full bio and various links of his in the show notes, and I encourage you to check it all out. Professor Huemer, one of your major works is The Problem of Political Authority, and today I want to focus on some particular aspects of this awesome book. But first, I would like to know some of your influences. What led you to become anarcho-capitalist, and when did this occur?
Yeah, good. Yeah, well, I was in college, and this was a long time ago, back near the dawn of time. I was in college at UC Berkeley, and I guess in my first year, I was some sort of like socialist, whatever, decentralized socialist. Okay, and then during my first year, there were like 3 different people who recommended I should read Ayn Rand. I didn't know who this was, but anyway, when the third person recommended it, then I did it. And I read, there's a section from For the New Intellectual, which is like an excerpt from Atlas Shrugged, okay? And it's a story about a car company where they tried to adopt the slogan, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And then there's just a very vivid description of what would happen, okay? And roughly what happens is, so you have to give to everyone according to their needs. So that means somebody has to decide what people's needs are. Okay, and then that means, well, they start having this contest to prove who is neediest. Because that's the way that you get anything. And then people actually start doing things to try to increase their needs, right? Or increase their apparent needs so that they get more stuff. And then from each according to his ability. So that means that more is going to be demanded of you if you have more abilities. And then people start competing to prove how little ability they have so that less will be expected of them. And then, it's just a complete disaster, right? And then, people start resenting each other because like every time somebody has a baby, it used to be a happy occasion, but now it's a cause for resentment because now everybody else has to pay for your baby. Okay. And then, I thought, that's not true socialism, but I also thought, but that is what would happen because I know people. That's how people are. So so then I became, some kind of libertarian. I think I was actually a natural born libertarian. I just didn't know it yet. And then, so I went to UC Berkeley, around 88 to 92. At that time, Brian Kaplan was there as a student also, who is today a well-known economist at George Mason, an anarcho-capitalist libertarian economist. Okay, so I met Brian, and then he started talking to me about anarchism. Okay, and then he got me to read Murray Rothbard and David Friedman, and my initial reaction was that anarchism sounds crazy, but then when you read these people, they have thought of all of the obvious objections. They have well thought out responses to everything that you think is a crushing objection, and it turns out that they make sense actually. So so that's roughly what happened. Yeah,
that's awesome, and this is reflected in the book itself. If you define its main conclusion at all, it's that political authority is an illusion, that arguments that favor authority are essentially intellectually, logically inadequate. And I consider it a solid takedown of the myth of authority. By the way, I'm using the term myth there in front of political authority. I use it because it conveys its falsity. You tend to be more even-handed. You call it a belief. Is it fair to categorize it as a myth?
Yeah. I'm not sure. There's like, we could have the semantics of it. Like, so, I had another book recently that they call Progressive Myths, which I recommend everybody should immediately buy. Mm-hmm. And in there, what I call the myths, they have to be sort of like objective factual claims. Right. So like, it's a myth that women get paid less than men for the same work. Okay. So, just very briefly, statistics don't really show that. But think like, oh, that the idea that the state has authority, that's, I mean, it's kind of a fact, but it's a moral fact. It's not really the right kind of thing to call a myth, right? So like, there's not, like if you went to a court of law and you said he lied because he said the state had authority and it doesn't, that's going down, because they're just going to say, no, it's just his opinion that the state has authority. So,
Yeah. All right. I think one thing I've noticed, though, is that libertarians, whether we call it a myth or belief, is probably an idle point. But in terms of libertarian strategizing or messaging, I'll see that predominantly the libertarians are focusing on the state and not really the belief in authority. I think of it like a person having a cough for many, many months and not really taking the time to drill down to the root of that because they might have a cancer and all they're doing is taking cough pills. So I see that as sort of an analogous, like not focusing on the root. But I even noticed that academics, as a rule, don't focus on that psychology aspect of what leads to the state. I'm curious why you think that might be.
Yeah. Well, philosophers don't really focus on empirical details. So the philosophers would just focus on like, oh, well, what are the kind of abstract a priori arguments that you could give for why the state does or doesn't have authority? They really should think about the psychology because that affects like how you evaluate the arguments. Like it could be that your intuitions are just infected by a bunch of biases. But philosophers generally don't think about that because then you would have to go read the literature in another field. and it would be empirical literature. And by the way, academics in general don't like to read stuff from other fields. It's like it's a very balkanized industry. It's just all these different fields, and then we just talk to each other within our own field.
Right. Your chapter 6, which is what I really would like to focus on today of the book, focuses on psychology, as you just said. And one of the aspects of that is the majority's perspective, where you really kind of hone in on what the majority, normal average people are doing, namely an intuition, as you said, that seems to defer to authority. And you show why we really can't trust that. Could you give us an overview of that?
There are a few different the results in psychology that I referred to. So, one is that I referred to the famous Milgram experiment. Yeah, so this is an experiment, roughly speaking, to see whether you could get people to electrocute an innocent person, using the demands of an authority figure. Okay, so whether they have a person who appears to be an innocent person who's strapped into a chair, and then the subjects of the experiment they have to give electric shocks to this person whenever he makes a mistake in some test. Okay, and then the shocks are supposed to increase in voltage. Okay, and the experiment is to see like how far somebody's going to go. Okay, so then you have the experimenter, this dude in a white lab coat, just insisting that you have to continue. Like every time you say like, I think this is getting out of hand here, he's like, no, you have no choice. You have to continue. Okay, so like how much can you get a person to do just by insisting that they have to do it and being an authority figure? Okay, and like the guy who's strapped in the chair demands to be let out. And then at some point he just refuses to answer anymore. And then the experimenter says, well, then if he doesn't answer, you have to keep shocking him. Okay. And it turns out that 2/3 of people will go all the way. Like they will go up to administering 450 volt shocks to a silent and unresponding victim, right? Who now appears to be either unconscious or possibly dead. Okay. So, and now what does this show that's relevant to state? Well, it's just that, man, there's just like this sort of emotional feel that you have to obey the authority figure, even in cases where you obviously don't. So, like if you describe the scenario to anybody just abstractly, anybody will say, well, like you can't keep shocking him after he asks to be let out. That's the point at which you have to stop. And most people think that they would stop at that point. Actually, I think almost everyone says that they would stop. And they predict that other people would stop as well. But that's not true. And so, well, what's going on? What's going on is that when you're in the situation and you're actually under the command of the authority figure, you suddenly have this feeling that you have to do it. It's like just very difficult to disobey. Okay, so now my suggestion is, well, because we're under the power of the state, we have this feeling that we have to obey them. And like if you were in a stateless society and then if you'd always grown up in a stateless society and then you heard about this other society where they have this state, you'd be like, what the hell? Why is everybody doing what those people have to say? There's these 535 clowns in Washington. They don't know more than everyone else. Why is everybody obeying them? Right? But it doesn't seem weird to us because we're just like under the power of the state. We've gotten used to it. Right. Okay, so that was the first thing. And there's a related thing, which is status quo bias, that people have a bias towards whatever is the status quo in their society. And just whatever everybody else is doing, what everybody else is saying and thinking, there's just a bias towards going along with that. And then you can like have sort of a motivation to come up with rationalizations for why the thing your society is doing is the best. Right. So, okay, that's the second thing. There's a phenomenon of Stockholm syndrome. And it's named after a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, I think this 1970s or something maybe, where the bank robbers took some hostages and like they took them in the bank vault, and they were holding these for days, okay? And then it turned out that the hostages formed an emotional bond with the kidnappers. So at one point they thought that the kidnappers were protecting them from the police. At the end of it, the hostages didn't want to leave without the kidnappers because they were afraid that if they left the kidnappers alone, the police would hurt the kidnappers. Right. Okay, so what was happening, and my hypothesis is, well, there could be an evolutionary mechanism whereby you try to bond with somebody who has power over you. Because in the past, if you didn't, if like you kept blaming the other person for how they're abusing you or whatever, it's likely that they would abuse you more. And like, if somebody has power over you and you say, hey, you have no authority, I'm not obeying you, then they would hurt you or possibly kill you. So you might have evolved this tendency to sort of like, so the way that you bond with them is you adopt their perspective. Right. Okay, and so like they're saying, well, you have to obey me, and then you go, oh yeah, I have to obey you. Right? Okay, so, the state has power. So like in our evolutionary history, there wasn't a state, but there were people who had power, like the chief of a tribe or something like that. So then you try to adopt their perspective. And then like that mechanism got transferred over to the modern society where, you just try to adopt the perspective of the state.
And I think that also explains the very general observation that the majority tend to follow the cultural trends of where they were brought up. People follow the religion generally of their community or family. They follow the clothing styles and diet of where they. I think that's a good explanation for that.
I mean that's why there is culture, right? There's culture because of the tendency to imitate and defer to other people. That's what a culture is. There's some stuff that got started, and then a bunch of people started imitating it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm fascinated by that psychology, and then I started to think about how does that tie into cause and effect when it comes to the state itself. In other words, the myth of authority seems at least to be an important root cause leading to the state. But for me to visualize it, I had to actually make a visual. But essentially, I'm thinking of a circle, or a clockwise circle of the dynamics of statism with the three major factors of statism along that circle: the myth of authority, the state itself, and then finally propaganda. And each seems to have an important causal role. So the myth causally leads to the state causally leads to an incentive to propagandize, and then finally propaganda causally reinforces the myth or the belief in authority once again. Does that hold water?
No, yeah, that seems right. I mean, yeah, so, the state, of course, attempts to reinforce its own power. Okay, so like they used to have everybody say the Pledge of Allegiance in class. I don't know if they're still doing that or not, but every day the kids are supposed to recite this loyalty oath to the state, right?
And look up.
To the flag, to the United States of America, and then the government sort of like takes that. They say, oh well, we're the United States of America, so actually you have to be loyal to us. But then, okay, we used to have civics classes. I don't know what they're teaching anymore because it's been a long time since I've been in high school, but they used to teach us about how good our system of government is. And they made it sound like basically it's the best system that you can have. Okay, and then they would tell us stuff about how it works that really sounds good. Like, yeah, we got this constitution, so the government can't do anything that's not in this constitution. See what a good idea that is? and if one part of the government does try to do something, it's okay because the Supreme Court will strike it down. See, good idea. And don't worry, like the Supreme Court justices, like there will be checks and balances. So like they'll be appointed by the president, but they have to be approved by the Senate. So, only good people will get on that court, right? There's like a lot of stuff that makes it sound good. And now it doesn't really work that way in the real world, right? It's like what happens in the real world is that the president appoints deliberately picks people who share his ideology and are going to rubber stamp whatever he wants to do. That's what Roosevelt did, right? He just like and he was in office for so long that by the end of his term, I think like all but one of the judges were Roosevelt appointees. So. Okay, so anyway, and they were just going to do whatever Roosevelt wanted, and then when the Senate approves or disapproves, it's just a political decision. But anyway, okay, I think I went off on a tangent there, but okay,
No,
so
but
you get the state trying to support itself, trying to support its own power by, like, why do they have to run schools? Like, why does the government have to run the schools? Now, I understand the argument that people need education, but then why wouldn't that just lead to, like with anything else, that they would just subsidize it? Why do they have to run the school? Right? Because like people need food and then the government provides food stamps or something. They don't like run a farm. So why do they have to run the school?
Right.
Well, maybe it's because they want the school to be supporting the state.
Well, exactly. And zooming out of that, it's why do they propagandize at all? And it's essentially because the belief in authority is false. It's a bad idea in terms of norms and human flourishing and peace. It's not conducive to that, and it also breaks down logically, like you've explained throughout the book. It's incoherent. So you have to have something that's going to essentially cloud the mind, so that it doesn't shed the light of reason on that bad thing.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah, and yeah, like part of it. Another thing that's in the chapter about psychology is there's sort of like symbols. There's symbols and stories that we tell people. Like if you just try to give people arguments for why the state has authority, arguments aren't that good, right? Smart people can poke holes in them, okay? But then if you sort of like appeal to people's emotions, right? So, we have stuff like, go into a courtroom sometime and kind of look at the aesthetics. There'll be sort of like the whole room is sort of oriented towards the judge. So like, it'll be I don't know about all courtrooms, but anyway, like often there will be, kind of a long courtroom. Then there's this position at the front that's just very clearly a position of authority. It's like it's elevated so that he could look down on everyone, right? And then then he's got like the special robes and everything that only the judge gets to wear, and little symbols of authority like his little gavel and stuff like that. So you see all that, and then you just have this feeling that that's the authority figure, right? It's like you got to appeal to people's feelings and not just their reason, because the reasons aren't that good.
When I thought about that, and then I lined it up with the other examples you gave, like Milgram and Ash and Stockholm, and even thinking about religious cults, any of these examples of psychological manipulation seem to have, to me anyway, a thread of mental isolation, or even sometimes physical isolation, or whatever, community isolation, where they really want the brain to be in this fog or cage, and that's what helps them achieve whatever particular thing they're after. Isolation really stood out to me as one of the elements.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Ash conformity experiment, which maybe the viewers don't know. It's this experiment to see if you can get people to say something that's clearly, observably false. Right? So there's a bunch of people in a room, and the task for the subjects of the experiment is to compare links of lines that they see on a screen. And there'll be like a comparison line, then you're supposed to say which of the following three lines is closest in length to the first line. Okay, and then and it's a task that's easy enough that there'd be 99% accuracy in normal conditions if you're not messing with them. Okay, but then what they do is like they have a bunch of Confederates and they tell like all the other people in the room to give the wrong answer. So right, so like the subject of the experiment sees these like multiple people before him say the wrong answer to the question, and then the question comes to him and he's supposed to answer. Okay, and then like most of the time, well, you can get people to sometimes give wrong answers. Okay, on a task that's kind of perceptually obvious, right? And so one thing that could be happening is they're just lying. They know it's the wrong answer, but they're just not willing to go against what the majority said. Another thing that could happen is they question their own judgment. So like according to the exit interviews, like that happened to a lot of people. They just thought, it looks this way to me, but everyone else is saying it's the other thing. I must be wrong. Which, when you think about it, actually is rational, right? It's more likely that you misperceived it than like 10 people in front of you misperceived it. So, okay. But, you can, because of this dynamic, you can get a situation where a whole bunch of people are wrong. Because if a belief gets started, then it can be sort of self-propagating, and then you can have information, you can have new evidence come in that goes against it, but then nobody wants to change because everybody else already has this belief and they don't want to go against everybody else. So, like, that might be that what happens with religion. Like, we could have had, like most religions started a long time ago. I think before we had modern science gives us some new evidence that maybe undermines religion. I mean, it would be a matter for debate, but, plausibly, your religious beliefs stick because, like, it's just reinforced by the rest of society, right?
Right. And once again, isolation pops out at me when I think about propaganda and the more about, I guess, the causal connection between the myth and the state. It struck me that it's not just the majority that are part of that causal connection. I started to think about what about the power seekers themselves? And when I say power seekers, I'm talking about politicians, law enforcement, military, people with a gun, or people who can call out the gun. And I feel like they play a psychological role in this, in the sense that, all right, so the myth of authority leads to the state. How does it do that? And it seems simple. It seems the myth, being an idea in the head of, we're assuming the myth of authority is ubiquitous in society, it's going to manifest itself invariably in action. And those actions, like voting and saluting the flag and, contacting your senator and say there ought to be a law, all these collective actions, it seems to me, create an environment, essentially an environment that's hospitable or welcoming to the power seeker type of personality, a person who gets some satisfaction out of bossing others around or interfering with their lives or whatever it might be. So there it is then. It seems like that causal chain is complete because now you have power seekers who inevitably are going to respond to this welcoming environment, kind of like flies are attracted to meat. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, that's right. And, this could be a serious problem for our society. Because, this is the basic idea behind government, according to most people, right? Well, human beings are flawed, and, if nothing is done to restrain us, we're going to be exploiting and abusing each other all the time, right? So we need to find a small group of people who can protect us from each other. We're going to give all of our guns to this group of people, and then they're going to stop the predators from hurting each other, from hurting us. And then, the classic problem is, well, but who's going to protect us from the protectors? Right. Because they're people too. And then, okay, and now a reasonable response to this might be, oh, don't worry, because actually it's only a small minority of people who are predators. And so if you just get normal people in power, they're going to use the power to stop the predators. But the problem with this is actually you don't just get normal people in power. You get power seekers in power. When you create the position of power, the people who are going to occupy it are the people who love power. And those people are not just normal people. They are less moral than average, right? And by the way, it's not like I think that the politicians are all evil, that they're psychopathic criminals, but I do think that they're kind of less moral than the average person. Right? Because they've been selected for, well, not only being power seekers, but for being the people who are willing to do what it takes, right? Because there's a competition, it's hard to get. And, the higher the position of power is, the more competition there is. And you've got to be the person who's willing to do whatever it takes to get that, right? And so, people complain that politicians are dishonest. You know why they're dishonest? Because an honest person couldn't win. Because, an honest person will not always tell people what they want to hear. And so, the person who will always tell people what they want to hear is going to get in office, but that person is a liar, right? Because what you want to hear is not regularly the truth.
That makes me think about how the majority of us libertarians, well, actually not just libertarians, everybody, conceptualizes the state. It's superficial. It stops at sort of the idea that this is a big group that has a lot of power and can do anything it wants. It reminds me a little bit of the Star Wars movies where the Galactic Empire is, I don't know the full mythology there, but more or less you get the impression they're there, they've always been there, they'll always be there, and they can do pretty much anything they want, full stop, that's the end of it. And it seems that's how we think of the state, as just ubiquitously powerful. In reality, it seems though that they are basically at the mercy of the environment that they are presented with. So if I go back to that myth of authority causal link, when we end up with the power seekers looking at the environment that's welcoming them because the myth creates these actions, they didn't create that environment. They're simply responding to it. So, for example, if you had a person in the United States or a group of people who say, I would like to be the mayor of a town, well, that's a choice that is available and open to them. So that's a choice that's possible. But if that same group said, I want to be the overarching emperor of the United States, they can't fulfill that. So they don't have all the power in the world. They are really at the mercy of the environment.
Yes, right, yeah. Yeah, so like, well, we establish these institutional structures which provide some kind of constraints. But, you know, like you can have people push against the constraints so they can sort of change it over time. Yeah, like, so you can't immediately become the emperor, okay? But you could sort of like make changes where the president gets more and more power. Okay, now, you know, the way it goes in America is like, well, you have to be able to win a popularity contest. So there's certain kinds of people who can get that position. If you want to be like the hereditary emperor, you're out of luck. Okay. But by the way, like, you know, just to be fair, other societies are much worse, right? If you're in a dictatorship, it's much worse. Because the way that you get power in a dictatorship is violence. Just like direct, immediate violence. You have to like murder the person who's in power, and then you seize power. Okay, and then in America, if you do that, the cops are going to arrest you, so you're not going to get the power.
In general, would it be true or fair to say that depending on what the culture is, like we'll say North Korea, for example, that's about as brutal as we get. There still has to be a belief in authority there, except it manifests itself in such a way that the political structure permits that kind of abuse of the population. And yet, I don't know that I don't know because I'm not there. I don't know that, and we don't get much news from there. I don't know that the population thinks of themselves as abused, or are they still overcome by this myth?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, it would be interesting to, you know, interview North Korean citizens and see what they think about the state. They're subject to relentless propaganda. They don't know what's going on in the rest of the world. I think that they generally know that things are better in South Korea. They probably don't know how much. They really have no idea how much better it is, you know, in South Korea or just, you know, the rest of the world, because, you know, total control of the state.
Well, one thing you said in the book, and I made a note of this because it stood out to me. It's in 13.2.4, and I'll quote it here. One thing that seems very plausible, and then you go on to say, if society no longer wished to have a legislature, then the legislature would not long persist. I love how you used a specific example, but I kind of broaden that to a generalization that essentially says the environment of whatever political or politics permits is really going to be whatever the tone of society's views are, or whatever the level of or form of the myth of authority happens to take at that time.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so in fact, like if you're an anarcho-capitalist, you can think about how we would make the transition to anarchy, and it's not possible right now because most people don't believe in it. Like, most people think that you have to have a state to have an orderly society, and that is a big part of why we have one. So, like, you know, even if the government just all resigned today, the next thing that would happen was immediately somebody would say, "Oh my God, this is horrible. We need to set up a government," and it would happen because everyone would agree with it, or 97% of people would agree with him, or whatever it is, you know. So that's why it would not be that hard to do it, right? If most people knew about the theory of anarcho-capitalism and they knew how sensible it is, then it would be hard to set up a state, right? Because you have to convince people to go along with you, and most of the people you approach think you're crazy, and then you get the few people who think that is a good idea, but then you can't do anything because 90% of the society thinks you're crazy. Okay, now so if you were already in an anarcho-capitalist society, you would think that the people who are trying to set up a state are crazy people. But if you're in a society with a state, then you think that people who are trying to create an anarchist society are crazy people. So there's really just a big transitional problem, right? Once the anarcho-capitalist society is established, if it works, then people would like it, and then it would be stable. It's just difficult to make the transition to that.
Right. I would think that at that point, you kind of brought it up. You mentioned, if you had a society that didn't have this myth of political authority, you can imagine a Star Trek episode where they arrive at a planet where this culture simply doesn't have the myth of, or any belief in political authority. They respect social hierarchies, consensual hierarchies, but nothing else. Then you can kind of put it back into that cause and effect and say, Well, there are still potential power seekers in that culture, no doubt. But how do they fulfill that? Well, they don't have a political structure to hook into. All they have are whatever abusive relationships. Maybe they can form one, or they can establish a religious cult. It would still happen, I would imagine, but it would have to be much more localized.
Well, so like in a capitalist society, well, really the way to get influence is to start a business that's really successful. And, to be really successful, like usually what you got to do is like make a product that people really like, or make it really cheaply or something like that. And these are all pro-social things. But, if you have a government, then a way to get a lot of influence is just seize the reins of power, right? Like get into the government, which does not necessarily require doing anything productive, right? Okay, so in the ANCAP society, like the most influential people would be like, amazing innovators or something like that, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're great people, but it's better than people who are great power seekers, who are great at lying and whatever, and manipulating people to get into office.
I would also think it would be stable for the reason that, I'd want your comment on this, that norm, the norm of consensual relationships in business, et cetera, comports more with our private intuitions, how we deal with our family, our neighbors.
Yes.
Basically, that's true today. Everyone is an anarchist in their private life. No one's going to tolerate the state saying, today you wake up at 10 in the morning, tomorrow you associate with this person. We are quite anarchist and don't have a belief in authority in that narrow respect. So it does seem we have those intuitions. A free society seems to comport with that and therefore might be more persistent.
Yeah. Well, you may be interacting with more people who are psychologically healthy, So, people who are not necessarily psychologically healthy might treat somebody in their life as an authority, like people in abusive relationships where the other party gets to just tell you what to do, right? and you just have to obey them, and then they smack you around if you don't do it. Okay, so, like our relationship to the state is kind of like relationship of somebody with an abusive boyfriend.
Sure. It's very much so. Or a cult, in the sense of it using a myth or some kind of superstition to cloud the mind. Which brings me to propaganda again. When I think about, again, these causal relationships, myth leading to state, let's say you were a libertarian strategist, you would say, well, I'm not going to try to make the myth not create the state, because that's almost causally inevitable. I'm not going to try to make the state not want to propagandize, because, again, it's psychologically, causally an incentive for them. But propaganda successfully reinforcing the myth seems to be the one vulnerable point along that line. An example is ourselves. As ANCAPs, we can introspectively see that we are not, that we are over this belief, and therefore propaganda is more or less something we're insulated from. So does it seem like attacking, has the libertarian's strategy of at least trying to get into the heads of people and get them over the illegitimate, or persuade them of the illegitimacy of the state, the best tactic in that regard?
Yeah, that is my view. Basically, like the reason why most people are not libertarians is that they believe in the myth of authority, right? They believe that the state has a kind of special moral status that places it above everybody else. And whether or not they would actually say that's sort of like somewhere in their mind, right? It's like implicit in the way that they're evaluating things, the fact that they don't evaluate the state's actions in the way that they evaluate anybody else's actions. And so, just like, and as you say, there's this propaganda that reinforces that. And I can't stop the propaganda, but if you reflect intellectually, you're going to see that it's really hard to justify the doctrine of authority. And so then the state can like keep producing this propaganda. They can sort of like make you feel a certain way. But if you realize what's happening, and by the way, this is part of why it's important to talk about the psychology. You have to realize what's happening in order to resist it, right? But if you do, you realize what they're doing, and you realize the non-rational reasons why you feel like you have to obey them, and then you know about the philosophical arguments, and you see why, well, there isn't really a good argument why you have to obey them. Then you can kind of get over it.
Okay, so I want to do something that you do a lot. Let P represent the level of propaganda that we see empirically in the real world and have always seen. Basically, relentless bombardment of propaganda coming from the state, which, so far as I could tell, is true in all states, all countries. They want to propagandize at a very high level. And also, I would imagine it's always been that way. So if it's appropriate, I want to set P to be that level. It seems that the state never goes less than P. It always bombards us. Why, I wonder, do you think that they never slip the mask, take the mask off, in the sense that it's almost like oxygen to them? They have to have it at this high level, like oxygen to us. We can't, well, in Boulder, I suppose you have a little wiggle room with oxygen, but really for a human, you can't go below some threshold. That's it. It seems like propaganda is like that. Why is P never less than P? Do you think?
That might be just from the way that you've defined it. Be careful. But I mean, different societies have different levels. Like, man, North Korea, they're really big on propaganda. It's like it's way more than the United States or the Soviet Union. Like, you wouldn't be allowed to criticize the government, and like every news story would be, look, the government is doing great. We're succeeding. We've exceeded our goals for the 10th year in a row. You may think that you're starving, but you're not. Whatever. Right. Don't believe your lying eyes. Anyway, no, it really is higher in other societies. And yeah, that's like, our government is going to they're going to put out propaganda. So they put out a press release. It's going to try to make the government look good. But you could have people are allowed to criticize them. So
right.
You can have news reports that,
So let me refine that then. Let's say then in the context of any given government or society, why would they never take a break? Why don't they take Sunday off? Why don't they say, wow, the propaganda we put out is so resource intensive, it costs, it's blood, sweat, and tears and all this. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to make it 90%. We don't see that happening. And I wonder why we don't see that happening.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Why doesn't the government sort of every once in a while admit that they don't have authority? You might say that. I mean, they don't normally talk about authority as such, like in those terms. They will talk about how they're doing a great job, and they'll just sort of presuppose it. They make a law, they'll just presuppose that obviously that you have to obey this because we said it. I think there are times when the government will admit to having done some bullshit. But so there's what comes to mind is when Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union admitted that Stalin had murdered a bunch of people or whatever. That the stuff the CIA had been saying about them was true, and so in a way that could be seen as undermining the authority of the state.
Right.
But
sure.
But the reason he was doing that was to undermine his political opponents, to undermine the Stalin loyalists, right, who were rivals for his power. So
So he himself would not have expected that the end result of that would be the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was trying to, he was pursuing his own praxeological incentives of doing what he thought would consolidate his power.
Yeah.
But in terms of the P, he made P less than P unwittingly, in a sense, because its end result was what it was, which was a fairly peaceful dissolution of Soviet Union style.
I mean, I don't know if you could connect that because it was decades later that the Soviet Union collapsed.
Oh, okay.
Khrushchev, so the guy from the 1960s.
Oh, that's right. I was thinking of Gorbachev. Okay, yes.
Yeah. So, and Gorbachev, he started this perestroika and glasnost, and I don't think that he thought he was undermining the state's authority. I think he thought that he was perhaps enhancing it, because this is going to be a great propaganda thing. We're embracing a new openness. You see how good we are. Okay, but it just wound up that, it wound up, there was a problem because there was this backlash,
right.
From these whatever hardcore communists, right? And,
yes.
But then people didn't want to give up the gains that they were making in freedom, so the whole thing wound up falling apart.
So I'm thinking now of technology. The book itself is 12, 13 years since it's been published, and technology has really advanced since then. And I wonder if it's safe to say that technology has permitted information flow to be very, very, very much decentralized in contrast to the early days of the internet or even pre-internet, and how that might relate to the state's ability to successfully propagandize.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, the state, it's really hard for the state to control information. Now, I guess they do this in China and North Korea. Actually, there are a bunch of websites that you cannot access. I don't know if people even have internet access in North Korea, but anyway, in China, a bunch of things that you can't access. You can't find out about the Tiananmen Square, whatever you call it, that happened decades ago. But yeah, but like in America, it's like really hard. And so then a bunch of people can expose things that the government is doing, but it's not going as well as you might have hoped, because there's also the possibility of people just producing a whole bunch of bullshit. It's like, like, yeah, okay, so the state like can't control the people who are criticizing them, but they also can't control like all of the just like ridiculous made up stuff that's on the internet. So it's not necessarily an overall good influence.
Right, right. But then I think of it almost in a mathematical sense. The propaganda, well, that's why I was using P. So today in a decentralized information world, people are consuming, they're choosing their content, let's put it that way, at a much greater level than they ever were in history. That right there means that it's likely that they're not choosing, let's say, a political website like the United States Office of Information. No, they're on TikTok, or they're looking at educational videos or entertainment videos. So mathematically, a greater percentage of their content consumption is not political, whereas in the past it was more force-fed. So I wonder if that alone helps to reduce the impact of the propaganda.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I want to say is like I don't know, as a side point, like actually government sources are usually better than most of the things people are looking at, but not propagandistic. So like occasionally the government has something that's like ideological, like the Office of National Drug Control Policy will produce something about why drugs are bad, and then it's like propaganda. Okay, but also the government publishes a bunch of like statistics. Like you can go to the website for the Federal Reserve and you're going to get like tons of information about the economy, and it's going to be real. Okay, or like you can go to the FBI's website and you can get tons of information about crime in the United States, and it's the real information. And it's way better than like the stuff that people are making up on TikTok or whatever as far as reliability. So there's like certain things like they're pretty reliable, but they're not. It's pretty good. Like they're not lying all the time. They're not saying they're not like claiming that they've eliminated crime, right? Which might happen if you are in a communist country. Although in fact they do have much lower crime, but like in the communist country they'll just be claiming that they've done a bunch of stuff that they didn't do.
Right. But one thing they won't say is taxation is theft.
That's right. Yeah. Like you go to the IRS website, they're not going to talk. They're going to talk. I assume they're probably going to have stuff about why it's really great to pay your taxes.
Yeah. I one time I actually went in there and I drilled down a little bit to find out is there any point in there where it sort of justifies it. And what I did find was, you're obligated to pay because all these wonderful things happen, and it is voluntary. So they're actually willing to make the statement it's voluntary. And so, that's propaganda right there. It's not voluntary.
What do they even mean? Like if you don't file it, it's voluntary, so I don't have to file a tax return, right? No, you have to do it. Well, but, and then like they withhold money from your paycheck anyway, right? Like if you have an employer. So it's like it's taken out. You didn't even send them the money. Like they took it out before you even got it. So, I think most of the time they'd be happy if you don't file a return, because then they just keep the money that was withheld.
Right. There's no refund. That's exactly right. But I do wonder if the impact of decentralized information overall is going to help to some degree undermine the effectiveness of propaganda.
Yeah. I mean, my hope is that, I had an influence with writing books like this. I just put out the idea and then maybe it will spread. And, United States is pretty good compared to other countries, right? It's like there's bullshit going on in every society. So there's bullshit going on in the United States, and there's room for things to get much better. But it's still much better than most societies. So, you can actually say this stuff. You can actually say why the state doesn't have authority, and then they won't come and arrest you and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
But by the way, actually, it would be hard for the state to stop it if they wanted to, even if they try, because people could just post anonymously on the internet.
Right, exactly right. I mean, even this conversation right now, here's one person all alone, right, on a computer and talking to you, and this can get to anyone in the world in theory and inspire them or not inspire them or whatever. But that very situation has never been possible. And that's why it almost does seem like we're in a new phase of this where it's almost it is experimental. We don't know how something like this ends up hashing out when everyone in the world can really communicate with almost anyone else, or at least choose the content that you choose.
Yeah, yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, like, oh, if you're in China, maybe you cannot watch this. I suspect that there are ways around it. I suspect that people could reroute their connection so that it looks like it's coming from a different place, and then they could still watch
Exactly.
it. But then,
Right. I've known, I have an IT background, and I've known actual developers, and I will tell you the one thing that is very common among them is they love a challenge. So if the government is whatever using encryption to do this or that, that's just a thrown up challenge to them. Like, let me figure out how to get around this. That's why I can imagine that there'd be thousands or tens of thousands of young people who have IT expertise right now who are actually trying to get around some of the constraints just because that's their personality type.
yeah, that's good. Yeah,
But the other reason that I feel white-pilled or hopeful in this technological shift that we're going through, I factored in age stratification in my mind. And I thought about the boomer generation, for example, which is my generation, and where I'm just lumping myself into that, even though I'm ANCAP, but we're the generation who I think is most indoctrinated, most propagandized, because our parents were the World War II generation. We grew up with the CBS Evening News, and that was how you got your content. But we're aging out, and the next generations down, X and Y and so on, it seems are less thoroughly propagandized because they grew up in an era where they had more control over their content.
yeah. No, that's right. Yeah, we have a more egalitarian society, and particularly a more egalitarian information ecosystem. It used to be like there was a small number of like authorities, like these major networks would be the sources of information about current events, and there's only a few of them, and then like you have to get in with them, right? So you have to get in with the institutional powers, and then now just like a 15-year-old kid could post content and just spread it, and they could become influential. They could, 15-year-old could get 1 million followers or whatever. Okay, so then I think there's less belief in intellectual authority, which could be either good or bad, right? So like on the one hand, well, like the established authorities might have certain biases, and so like the major media companies might have biases. They might have pro-government biases actually, because if they piss off the government, then they could be in trouble. And then, or like the government could just like not help them. So like like if you're in the news industry, you want to get stories, and like the government could just say, well, so we're not going to talk to you guys because you're not friendly to us. We're going to talk to your competitors. So we're going to give information to your competitors or whatever, so that they can do their news stories. Okay, but then with the internet, where there's just like anybody who wants to can post anything, like it's a lot harder for the government to control anything.
Yeah, well, and again, my generation, the older ones, if you walk into, say, any assisted living room of a person who's 70, 80 years old and look at their TV, at some point, they're going to have up there what? They're going to have that grid, that grid of stations on the left, and they're going to have the time on the top, and they're going to see what's coming up. What can I watch? It was always about what are they serving up to me? What are they telling me what to watch and think? You can't imagine anyone under 30 or 40 even using those kind of TV grids or station schedules anymore. Why? Because they're picking what they want. Even if it's news or entertainment or education, whatever it is, it's their choice. There's, let's say, 16 hours in everyone's waking day, and it used to be divided in such a way that I feel there was more propaganda coming from government gatekeeping sources than today. And that does seem to be a natural reason to see the propaganda eroding. Yeah.
No, like we've had this like in the last several years that there's less trust in official sources, and that includes government sources. And as you recall, the CDC sort of undermined their own credibility during the COVID-19 pandemic thing. Like famously by saying, "Oh, nobody needs a mask," and then like a few months later, everybody needs a mask. Right. It's like, okay, so like we know that you were lying one of these times. Okay, but part of it is that okay, you're watching content and like, oh, you can hear from the official sources, but then you can immediately hear the critics of those sources, and the critics are just like, no hesitation, like, oh, CDC total bullshit, president total bullshit. And they just keep doing it and nothing happens to them. So then there's just a completely different environment. Like, it's cool. It's totally fine in our society to totally reject the official sources. this isn't completely positive, right? Like sometimes this is good because sometimes the official sources are full of shit, but also it's just sort of like there's this anything goes, right? Because like, the unofficial sources can just say, they can say their own total bullshit, right? It's just different bullshit, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think I look at it like in the anything goes kind of concept. We have that today in fashion, in a sense. We have that in cosmetics. We have that in other areas where anything goes in the sense that it isn't really governed all that much by the state, and yet it isn't complete Mad Max chaotic hellscapes. It finds its way, so to speak.
No, that's right. Well, most of the time, just like free competition is great because it gives the consumers what they want, and usually what the consumers want is good. Usually they want a good product. Unfortunately, it's not as great when the product is information, and you can get whatever information you want. And because like the quote information that you want might not be the truth. It might be that you want to hear certain things, and the things that you want to hear might not be true, and the free market is going to give it to you anyway, right? And because we're in a democracy, there are negative externalities from having false beliefs, false political beliefs, right? Which is that, well, you can influence policy, you can vote, and then you can vote based upon your false beliefs, and then that can impose harms on everyone else. So there's a problem. Not that I have a solution to this, right?
Right. In your book, you were foreseeing ahead and talking about, you called it abolition of the state. I don't know that you meant, of course, violent or anything like that. You just meant, I assume, the withering away. But you said abolition requires people to accept only a single philosophical idea, skepticism about authority. I want to hone in on that expression of it. Do you look at that as simple skepticism in more of a, well, we are today a little bit more skeptical of authority than we were? Or do you see it more as explicit? We need to adopt anarcho-capitalism. We need that really like to a great degree.
Yeah, I mean, by skepticism of authority, I just mean like not believing that there's a group of people with special moral status where they're entitled to tell everyone else what to do, and we're obligated to obey them just because of who they are or because of what position they're in. Now, this doesn't immediately lead to anarcho-capitalism because it requires substantial argumentation to explain why an anarchist society could work. I think skepticism of authority leads to libertarianism. It leads to your wanting to reduce the activities of the state to only the things that you think that like a normal person would be entitled to do. So like I'm entitled to protect other people. If I see somebody trying to commit a violent crime against an innocent person, I am entitled to step in and stop them from doing that. Maybe I'm not obligated to do it, right? But it's not wrong for me to do it. Okay, so like I would like the state to do that. If we have a state, I would like the state to do that. Okay, but I'm not entitled to like take somebody else's money just because they're wealthy and then give it to somebody else who has less money just because they have less money. I can't do that. And so I would like the state to not do that either. So I think that sort of libertarian position results from being skeptical of authority. To become an anarchist, then you have to talk about, well, why? How would it work? How do we stop crime if we don't have a single central authority figure? Like, okay, we would have like competing protectors and how the business would work and why this is not going to be monopolized and whatever, it's not going to descend into total chaos.
Yeah, I actually think of it that way myself. Skepticism and also sort of the foundational roots of the persistence for a free society. When I think about 50, 60, 70 years of libertarian scholarly work like your own and economic works, Hazlitt, Mises, and so on, to me, those are less about trying to actually persuade the masses as it is setting foundational structures for the eventual emergence of free societies. In other words, the philosophers of that time will have something to kind of refer back to and say, oh, this is a great way to ensure our society's persistence. Whereas the skepticism part seems more like you talked about it. The analogy I've used was a bucket, and when the bucket tips, meaning when it's filled to the brim, that's our tipping point in society. That's the point where a free society is on its way. There's really no going back now. And that is a bucket of skepticism. So the question for me then would have been, what adds to that bucket? I used to think it's only anarcho-capitalist thinking. If I am a red-pilled anarcho-capitalist, my cup of skepticism is now poured into the bucket, but nothing else qualifies. I've come in the last few years to change that and think it's actually a lot of thimblefuls of skepticism by everyone. They're not becoming ANCAP. They're just seeing things that makes them wonder, gee, is it really right that the president can do this? A little thimbleful added to that bucket. And this is just my little metaphor. I'm assuming that alone, given the number of people in the world or in the country, will fill up that bucket.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, good. Yeah. It's good to remember that most people are not ideological. They're not particularly ideological. So, I think that one of the big things that's going to influence, I guess, sort of like the change in society is just like having different practices and seeing that they work. So like what we need to do is not first just convince everyone that anarchy is a great idea. What we could do is start by convincing people like, it would be a good idea to outsource some of the government's duties. They're having a hard time. The courts are having a hard time with their caseloads. They're really full. It's taking a really long time. Let's outsource some of these cases to arbitration, which, as a libertarian, you could think, yeah, that's privatization of the court function. But you don't have to say that to people. It sounds ideological. Just like, wouldn't it be great if this arbitrator solved this court case, it's going to take 6 months. If it goes to the government courts, it's going to cost people $100,000. That's just, okay. And then what if that just keeps, we just do more and more of that? And then but eventually then people are just going to get used to thinking that when you have a dispute, you go to an arbitrator, not when you have a dispute, you go to the government, right? And then, maybe eventually the situation could arise where you don't need the government courts anymore. And at that point, then, the kind of status quo bias works in favor of that, right? Then if somebody wants to go back to using government courts, that person sounds like a weirdo. Why would we do that? Okay, and then there's a similar thing with the police, right? Okay, well, we're having some problems with the police. Sometimes they're roughing up suspects that they shouldn't be. We shouldn't be doing that. What if we hire private security guards to patrol certain areas? And there could be competing private security guards. We're not giving them a permanent contract or anything. We're just give them a contract for a year, and there's other companies that we'll go to if we don't like what they're doing. Okay, so the competition is keeping them in line, and then. We could do that more and more. And the initial motivation wouldn't be, we're trying to get to anarchy. The initial motivation would be, let's just try to get better police services.
One of the psychological, I think, grounding for that comes from the Milgram experiment. There was the one variation that was, to me, the most telling, and that was when the subject when the subject wasn't isolated as the only one under the authority of the authority figure, but they introduced a second subject, which was also a plant, just like them, also flipping the switch, but they were instructed to, at some point, disobey. That's all it took. That 65% value dropped down to 10. So there it is. That's kind of all you need is permission to invoke your intuitive norms.
Right, yeah. This is also similar to the Asch conformity experiment. If there's one other person in the room who gives the correct answer, then the rate of giving the correct answer for the subject just goes way up, right? They're willing to defy the group if there's somebody else with them. Now, I think this doesn't necessarily translate to all cases, right? Because these are particularly extreme cases. Somebody's asking you to electrocute someone. That's an extreme case. It may be easier to disrupt the influence of the authority in that case, as opposed to cases where they're asking you to do something much less extreme, like paying them some money. Just give us some money. Right. So, people are not going to stop paying taxes because they heard that there were a few tax evaders.
Right. And yet the examples help, like you were saying before, seeing a court that can be private, seeing a fire department that can be private, seeing a road that's private. Nothing works like examples. Today, I thought it was dozens, but I guess there's actually hundreds of small experiments going on that are attempting to introduce some kind of geographic consensual type communities. They're not ANCAP necessarily. In fact, I don't think most of them are. Morazan in Honduras and Prospera are examples of this where they're being given a lot of free rein. There's no need to comment on whether they'll be successful or not. But the point is that if some of them are successful over the coming decades, nothing succeeds like success. In fact, it occurred to me recently that if they are indeed successful, nothing puts a lie to the fundamental justification for statism than that, namely that without the state, we descend into utter chaos and Mad Max hellscapes. if people see that that's not a hellscape and it's been around for 10 years and people seem happy and prosperous, that almost seems like the nail in the coffin for the state.
Yeah, yeah. You know what? Like the best way to undermine statism is to have an alternative institution, and what's going to undermine it is self-interest. So if we had sort of meaningful, easy competition among societies or like models of how society could work, then people would just go to the one that was working best out of self-interest. They, not ideology. Just like, if you see that Prospera is doing great, and like you could, if it turns out that if you go there, you can double your salary, and the crime rates are lower or whatever, even some leftists would start going there.
I would definitely refer everybody to the second part of your book, The Problem of Political Authority, because that talks a lot about how free societies can be feasible, are not improbable, and so on. And you get into a lot of details. And that, for those who like on-the-ground type of solutions, not just the theoretical side, which is most people, it's probably the best book for that kind of mindset. I'm sure that's why you put it in there.
That's right. Yeah. I tried to explain just in practical terms how anarchy could work. Most people have no idea. Most people's picture of anarchism is, let's have a complete free for all. Anybody does anything at any time, and that is not any anarchist's view, right? Their view is that we have alternative mechanisms for providing order and security. So the ANCAP view is, essentially privatizing protective services. The government is protecting us, but we could have private companies do the job instead. And why would that be better? Well, you need sort of like competition in order to get the best out of people. Government doesn't have competition. Like the cops don't have competition. There's one police department in the city. There's no competition. So if they do badly, they don't lose their jobs. Actually, if they do badly and crime goes up as a result, they get more money, right? Because the politicians will say, there's more crime. We need to give more money to the police, right? So actually they have perverse incentives to do badly, not to stop crime. If there was competition, like, you have private security companies, and then like your neighborhood can hire, will sign a contract with whatever security company they think is best, then they would all compete with each other to do a good job. To like try to stop the crime without inconveniencing the non-criminal residents too much, right?
And that's, for me personally, that's always been the frustrating part of this whole movement, in that it does seem to have to focus on those practical solutions, even though, for me, again, personally, it's the moral arguments against statism that carry more weight. It's just wrong to initiate violence, period. And so it's a little bit like the old arguments, like when slavery was being pondered, should we abolish it? Well, who would pick the cotton? And at the time, that might have seemed like a valid argument. Well, who will pick the cotton? You should have an answer for that before we let these slaves go. And it's like, well, actually, no, that's kind of your problem, plantation owner. You got to figure that out. But even that kind of a moral, simplistic sounding argument to me holds weight. It's like, no, you have to kind of figure it out. But unfortunately, that really isn't how it is. Most people really do need examples.
Yeah. Well, so, it, kind of depends upon exactly what you think will happen. Because like many people think that if we don't have a state, then it's just going to be like everybody's in constant danger of being murdered. We're just like, everything's going to collapse. There will not be supermarkets, because like if somebody tried to make a supermarket, there would immediately be a mob that would just like attack that person, kill them, and then steal all the stuff. Okay. And like, all right, well, so if that's our alternative, then I guess we have to go with the state. Okay. And you might say, well, the state is violating people's rights, but maybe you can violate people's rights to prevent a total disaster, like total breakdown of society, right? Here's a sort of libertarian argument for what's wrong with the state. The state, by definition, has a monopoly on its activities, however you want to describe them. It's doing certain stopping crime, and then like putting people in jail and charging money, so collecting taxes, whatever. And then, but they're monopolizing it, like they're forcibly preventing anyone else from doing the thing that they're doing. So the thing that they're doing is either wrong or not wrong. If it's wrong, then you have to abolish the state. Okay. If it's not wrong, then it's wrong for them to forcibly stop other people from doing it. Right. So, if forcing other people to give you money so that you can give it to the poor, if that's permissible for the state, then why are they stopping me from doing it? Like, I also want to do that. I also want to do the very same thing that they're doing. And so how can they come and tell me that that's wrong and that they're going to stop me from doing it?
what I love about that is I always step back from these and look at the 30,000 foot level. Those arguments undercut the very principles on which the state rests. In other words, it's contradictory, it's illogical. Even if you attempt to justify it by some kind of extreme examples, you still are pressed to push it to that extreme. Whereas in the normal day-to-day type of situations, like you said, you're not allowed to do it. That tells me that, or at least it illustrates for me, the vulnerability and weaknesses of the state. We don't think of the state as weak because we see its outer exterior power. We see tanks and SWAT teams. But we don't necessarily always think of its philosophical underpinnings. And when you think of that, they are pretty weak. Not to mention, as you said before, they're numerically weak. They are a sizable minority against the rest of the population.
Yeah. So, you might say they're intellectually weak, but physically strong. There are a lot of people working for the government, right? But it's sort of like even within the government, it's like a small people are controlling the rest of the government. Right. There's like 535 people in Washington who are just like telling 300 million people what to do. Like, that's kind of weird. And and like they have a whole lot. They have like an army of people with guns. But why are those people listening to these clowns, right? And then whatever at the Supreme Court, there's like another 9 people. So. And it's just like, well, I don't know. We've just established this equilibrium in which that's what we're doing. And like, if one person turns against it, they can't because everybody else is still doing the thing.
I actually put numbers to this because this was part of some of the thinking and work I did in my essays and podcasts. I was curious, what is that number? I had to pick like, what is the class of people I'm trying to count? And so I picked politicians, judges, prosecutors, because they're generally elected. So they're the ones to whom the myth applies. They're the leaders, so-called. And then I included enforcers who are trained and armed because they're the enforcers. We, meaning, according to the myth, we have to respect the officer. We have to obey the officer, and we do. So armed and trained personnel in military and police count. And I sent it into 3 different AIs just to have it all calculate for me. And it converged on roughly 2.5, 2.7 million people in the United States. So I just rounded up to 3 million, meaning 3 million people who actually have authority to force you to do what they want, or have the guns on speed dial, let's say. And 3 million then roughly is about 100 to 1 ratio. So I asked the question, how is it that one person can dominate 100 and they only weigh, as if the 100 believe that it's okay for them to be dominated?
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, so like, your initial answer is, well, force, they have the weapons. Actually, in America, there's hundreds of millions of private guns. So actually we have the weapons too. The government will use force periodically, but there's it's like a small percentage of criminals. If everyone was disobeying the government, they could not enforce the law. It has to be that the vast majority of people are going to go along with it. So it's got to be the vast majority of people basically think that they have to go along with it. They basically believe in the state.
Exactly. And that was one of the reasons that I also realized the myth of authority statism is particularly vulnerable. I thought about this. There's 200 countries in the world. And now pick any given person in a particular country, my neighbor. How many of those 200 do they have the myth of authority for pertaining to themselves? Well, it turns out it's one. It's the United States government. You could extend that to their city and county and state. But the point is, out of 200 countries in the world, only one is, for them, a true legitimate leader. So if China, Canada, Brazil were to say, we're going to govern the United States right now, yes, pretty much every citizen here would say, I don't have a myth of authority for you. I have a myth of authority for one. So yes, any given person on the planet only has essentially one. So that seemed like less of an uphill struggle when I thought of it from that perspective.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a good question for theories of authority. Like, so why do we have to obey the United States government, but we don't have to obey the government of China? Like, what if the government of China passes a law that says that we have to do something? Why do we not have to do it? And this is a challenge. Some theories of authority would seem to suggest that you do have to do it, right? Where if it's sort of like, if it's based on, the government is just doing really good things and they're like providing justice or something like that, and you have an obligation to support justice, then it may look like, you just have to obey governments in general. Okay, now, if you go to a foreign country and then they have different laws there, there's a question as to whether you would think that you have to obey the laws. I guess most people would say you do still have to obey the laws of wherever you are, but I think the feeling of deference would be less. So if you go to the other country and they have different laws from the ones that you're used to, you might kind of feel okay about breaking them. More okay than the people who live in that country would feel. So you go to North Korea and they have all these laws about how you're not allowed to criticize the government, I assume. You'd be like, I don't care about that. I do care about not getting arrested and hurt. I care about not having the government hurt me, so I'm going to try to avoid getting caught. But I'm not going to feel like I'm doing anything wrong.
Right. And that also is something that I can't land on even in my own mind. We're fairly convinced that this myth of authority is the primary reason people self-comply. And yet, if you ask any given person, if the government were to tomorrow just say, all taxes are voluntary, no penalty if you don't pay, in fact, you don't have to pay, your choice, most wouldn't do it. So does that mean they don't really have as strong a belief in authority and more of a fear of the consequences?
Oh, yeah. Well, so, I mean, that thought experiment might be testing whether you think just taxes are so beneficial that you should pay. But in your scenario, the government gave you permission to not pay. So it's okay. But what about this scenario? Suppose the government says, no, look, you are obligated to pay. Just as a side point, completely irrelevant to this, we have fired all of our enforcement officers to save money because we're sure that we can trust you to pay voluntarily. How much money are they getting next year? The revenues would drastically decline, and they would decline more in further years as people observed that the people who didn't pay the last year, nothing happened to them.
Right.
So, okay. So it's sort of like, well, the fear of getting enforcement action, the fear of having the government send the men with guns after you, it's sort of like working together with a belief in authority. If they lose the people with guns, then we're going to start to lose our sense of their authority. We don't think that this is what's going on. We don't think that we're obeying out of fear or that we only believe in their authority because we're afraid of them. But that is part of why we believe in their authority.
Right. That's amazing. That only further illustrates why psychology is such an interesting aspect of this movement. And again, it befuddles me that we haven't seen more work like your own. Believe me, when I started my podcast and my efforts in these essays to focus strongly on psychology and the root of statism, I really made an effort to look around for all the scholarly work, academic work that dealt with the psychology of statism, and there just isn't that much out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I was just reminded of the cognitive dissonance theory that I forgot to mention earlier. So there's a theory that so cognitive dissonance is a sort of like feeling of tension, a tension between two of your beliefs or between your beliefs and your actions, right? Or between your self-image and the objective evidence. Okay, and the theory is that people adjust their beliefs to reduce cognitive dissonance, and sometimes this is irrational. So if you find yourself doing something that would seem to be immoral, then there's psychological pressure to change your beliefs so that you believe that it is moral. Okay? Or just sort of change your beliefs so that the evidence matches your self-image. Okay, so one thing that we do is we're constantly obeying the state. It's not that pleasant to believe that we're just afraid and that we're doing all this out of fear. It's more pleasant to believe that we're conscientious. So we're paying our taxes because we're good, conscientious people and we're supporting the good of society. And that is the self-image that you would like to have. And so, you just adopt the beliefs that this is the morally right thing to do. Maybe it's morally obligatory and the state is good and they have legitimate authority to ask for this and so on. But if they lost their power, they fired all their enforcers, then suddenly it's in your interest to stop paying. And then maybe you would stop paying, then maybe you would just change your beliefs to say that it was okay to not pay, right? And this is, just sort of the influences on your beliefs are not just the evidence and the logical reasons for the beliefs. It's sort of your interests and what you want to believe about yourself also influence your beliefs.
That cognitive dissonance is illustrative. I've referred to it in terms of true self and false self in the human mind, in terms of, let's say, libertarian strategy. True self being our private lives, where I was saying before, we're all anarchists in our private lives. We generally respect non-aggression, private property, and all that. And I called it true because it always struck me as being our intuitive natures, and you tend to see it across cultures and across time pretty much. If you just look at any family unit through history, they'll tend to be like that, or community even. But the false self is that indoctrinated self, the propagandized self, the one that essentially clouds the mind from examining the state or whatever else they're indoctrinated about. And we live our lives pretty much with those two selves persisting if we're never really exposed to anything that would challenge that. But when it is challenged, when you talk to your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner about anarchism, you're causing a cognitive dissonance. You're making that false self be forced to kind of shine the light of the true self on it, and it doesn't like that.
Yeah. I mean, people may not like to have you sort of question their beliefs and practices. I think, like, my experience in talking with people about the authority of the state is it's pretty easy to get people to see the issue. You're like, it's pretty intuitive. Like, so I can't go to my neighbors and just like take their money and demand that they pay me so that I can give it to charity, or like tell them what substances they can put into their body, just give a list of other things the government is doing. What if I decide that, there's some other country where bad stuff is going on, I'm going to start blowing up some buildings and shooting some people in order to stop that government from doing things? Okay, so, just describe things that the government does, and people would be like, yeah, that's horrible, you cannot do that. That is absolutely wrong. And then, and then you point out that, so that's what the government is doing. And like, people see that, right? I don't think that I've ever had anybody not see that comparison. Right? And then you're like, so what's going on? Why is it okay when they do it? And like, people see that that's a problem, and then they generally see that they don't have an answer to it. It's like, right. Sometimes, so they'll start to say, oh, it's the social contract. Like, we have a contract. And then that's kind of easily refutable. Like, there's like a few theories that people give that are easily refutable, and then and they'll be like, yeah, I don't know why that's okay. Right.
I've learned just through trial and error that the first step of that, which is point out these inconsistencies in how we morally look at the actions of the state versus private actions, and then I've learned you almost have to stop there and let it simmer in their mind. Because if in my early years, certainly, I would just go all the way. So therefore, the state is illegitimate. Don't you see it? And that's too much. The cognitive dissonance is too much in the way, and they'll actually double down, or they'll want to walk away. Whereas I've noticed if I spoon feed it a little bit more and let their mind gel on it, if I'm lucky, they might come back later and say, I'm curious about whatever. All right. Now their mind is starting to ready itself to process.
No, that's right. That's right. That's why I like in the first half of the book, just spend all this time talking about how the state doesn't have authority. I think most people's I don't know, intuitive sense is that, well, you just need to have a state in order to prevent this total collapse of social order. And plausibly there's a justification for doing things that would normally be rights violations if you have to do it to stop some disaster. So like, I had this story in the book, and like, this is a thing that statists could say, where you're on a lifeboat and the boat is in danger of sinking, and for some reason you can't get these people to bail out the water just by telling them, but you happen to have a gun, so you could point it at these other passengers and order them to bail out the boat, and that saves everyone. Okay, so just assume that they're going to die if they don't do this, and you force them to do it, and you saved everyone. So like, the people that you're coercing, you're saving them too. Okay, that seems justified. So that it would normally be a rights violation to use force to make somebody else do something. But if that's necessary to prevent just everybody from dying, then that's what you have to do. Now, I don't know if you agree with this, because some libertarians have very absolutist views about rights, like you can't violate people's rights no matter what, right? But I think it's I think it is permissible, and I think that's sort of like the common sense morality. It is okay to violate rights in extreme circumstances.
And when I hear those scenarios, I'm encouraged. And the reason is because it's not about landing on an answer to that. It's about the fact that, look at the person trying to justify statism. What an extreme example you had to concoct to try to undermine freedom. You had to go there. You didn't talk about, fire department being privatized or roads. You have, at least that's my observation, is they generally have to really construct some unrealistic, or let's say implausible, rare circumstances.
Yeah. So, imagine, so maybe you thought that scenario was right, you can't force them to bail out the boat. But suppose I extend it a little bit and I say, and then, I noticed that one of the passengers had a lot more money than the other one, so I pointed my gun at him and demanded that he give me the money. And then I gave it to the other passenger. That's not okay, right? So, like, you can get, like, pretty libertarian conclusions just by sort of, like, extending this thought experiment. Just a bunch of other stuff that the state does, just, do the analogy. But most people think that the situation really is that extreme. Like that the lifeboat is a fair comparison to our society. How if you didn't have a state, it would be like sinking.
Yeah, they think that because they're taught that, and the movies seem to imply that and all that. We're well past the hour. I don't want to abuse your time. I wanted to carve out any time that you might want to devote to any projects you might want to share or anything of interest on your end.
Oh, well, I would like to promote, I have a blog called Fake News on Substack, Fakenous. And also, everybody should buy my most recent book, which is Progressive Myths, in which I refuted a bunch of myths that progressives tell about our society.
Yes, I will tell them that they actually must buy it and immediately. That will
You
be
have
how
no
I will
choice.
phrase it. There is no choice in the matter in this case because it is, after all, a lifeboat scenario. So anyway, with that, I really want to thank you for the time. We'll wrap things up. Michael Huemer, I very much appreciate you taking the time with me today on the show. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
It was great talking with you, and thanks for having me.
Same here. And please, everyone, feel free to check out the links to Professor Huemer's work on the show notes. And of course, thanks everyone for joining us today. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.